The Roman Empire was the greatest land empire Europe has ever known. It went beyond Europe to other lands south of the Mediterranean Sea. Among those lands was a narrow strip of territory across the northern coast of Africa. It was here that the Roman Empire began, and began almost by accident, at Carthage. Creating an empire was probably the last thing the Romans had in mind when they fought three great wars, the Punic Wars, against the Carthaginians, finally defeating them in 146 BC. Afterwards, the Romans destroyed all traces of the fine city Carthage had once been, and killed or took away its inhabitants to become slaves.
The Romans razed Carthage to the ground to eliminate their deadly enemy, and while they were doing that, they were concerned simply to win the war and wipe out their opponents. As soon as they'd done this, they realized they had a problem, that here was a very, very rich, fertile part of North Africa, and they had wiped out the obvious place to have a city.
This beautiful city, which had stood on the Gulf of Tunis for 6 centuries, had shown the Romans something else, something very tempting. Carthage offered wonderful advantages, which the Romans could not afford to ignore.
It's got well-developed harbour facilities. It occupies a central Mediterranean position on the south side, at the closest crossing point to Sicily and Italy. It's an obvious point for a major trading city to develop. And I think that's one of the reasons why we see Carthage reborn and re-emerging as the capital of Roman Africa, which is to become one of the major economic players in the Roman world.
Carthage offered a fine port for trading ships, or for stationing vessels to patrol and control the trade routes along the coast of North Africa and across the Mediterranean Sea. Also, there was the territory inland from the coast, where vast square miles of wheat could be grown, and fine fruits, wines, olives, and other luxury foods could be cultivated. Much later, when the Romans had established cities and trade in North Africa, huge amounts of wheat and grain, salted fish, olives, wines, marble, and other exports were sent back to Rome every year.
We're talking about an area which embraces the countries of Morocco, Algeria, Tunisia, and Libya, right the way through to Egypt. This was a major source of agricultural wealth and, above all, grain.
The area that we think of today as northern Tunisia, northeastern Algeria, receives sufficient rainfall to allow very good grain crops to be grown. And the historian Josephus, writing in the 1st century AD, talks about how, while Egypt provided grain for Rome for 4 months of the year, North Africa provided grain for 8 months. Now, you don't need to take that absolutely literally, but it does show the relative importance of North Africa in feeding Rome.
But at the start, founding a Roman colony there was by no means an easy task. The reason was a long series of civil wars among Roman leaders, and several murders, including the killing of the famous Julius Caesar in 44 BC. It was 14 years after the death of Caesar that his great-nephew, Octavius, at last triumphed over all his rivals and became sole ruler of Rome. He is better known as the first Roman emperor, Augustus, a name which meant deserving of respect and trust. That was why it took nearly 100 years before the Romans returned once more to the site of Carthage in 29 BC, and this time succeeded in founding their own city. It became known as Colonia Julia Carthago, and afterwards became the capital of Roman Africa. In time, Colonia Julia Carthago was followed by other foundations like Leptis Magna, now in Libya, 75 miles east of Tripoli, and Dougga, now in Tunisia. Cities like these were not only magnificent with wonderful buildings and fine streets, they showed that the Romans intended to stay in North Africa because they brought their way of life and its many comforts with them. "2,000 years ago, the lifestyle of the Romans was the envy of the ancient world. No other people lived in such luxury. Even poorer Romans were able to enjoy the splendidly built roads and the entertainment provided by theaters and games. They enjoyed better health, too. Roman cities had public baths and clean water brought in by aqueducts. After 29 BC, all these advantages appeared in North Africa for the first time, and except for slaves, prisoners of war, and criminals, they were open to everyone. This came about because of a process known as Romanization. Once a territory was conquered, the Romans preferred not to control it by force or terror. Instead, they usually offered the benefits of their civilization to its people, and some were given Roman citizenship. Although some conquered peoples clung stubbornly to their own ways of life, like many Britons, this citizenship was greatly valued.
One of the most clever things about Roman colonization was their subtle approach to local cultures and religious beliefs. They basically allowed local religions to continue doing the same things, observing the same practices as they always had, as long as some gesture was made to them being Roman, so that, for example, a local god might also take on a Roman name. The actual religion wouldn't change, it would just be called something that looked a bit Roman.
As the settlements in North Africa became more Romanized, they did indeed build temples to Roman divinities. And we find Roman-style temples, that is, temples raised up on platforms with columns on the front and with a staircase from the front, which ultimately are a type which developed in Italy. And they are in honor of Roman divinities. And the fact that African cities wanted to build those temples shows just how much they had embraced Romanitas, Roman civilization.
It was not surprising that so many people conquered by the Romans preferred to live like this, rather than in the cold, damp, drafty huts and rough villages that existed outside the Roman Empire. Just look at these beautiful mosaics, with pictures made from tiny colored stones. Mosaics like this can be seen today in the ruins of Dougga. A particularly fine mosaic, known as the Lord Julius mosaic, is now in the Bardo Museum in modern Tunis. It shows how luxurious life could be in a Roman villa in North Africa in the 4th century. You can see the rich landowner surrounded by his servants, and his wife putting on her jewels with the help of a servant girl. The center of the Lord Julius mosaic shows their splendid villa. Inside, the walls of villas like this were decorated with beautiful paintings and friezes, or borders. There was every luxury item which money could buy: bronze statuettes, statues of Roman gods and goddesses, carved lamps, beautifully made tables and silk cushions of many colors scattered over the floors. The dining rooms in Roman villas were often splendid places, with beautiful decorated walls, and a table surrounded by couches on which the Romans lay when they ate. Some of the finest and most complete villas in Roman North Africa have been uncovered by archaeologists at Bula Regia, 5 miles north of the modern town of Dougga in northwest Tunisia. They have bedrooms and dining rooms opening off a central courtyard, where modern visitors, like the original inhabitants, can cool off after time spent in the fiercely hot North African sun. Some of Bula Regia's villas were built partly underground to keep them cooler. Roman villas often had their own baths, but many people preferred the public baths, where they could meet their friends, discuss business, or just enjoy a relaxing time. Roman emperors often built huge public baths to let people know how great and powerful they were. And among them were the baths built at Leptis Magna by the Emperor Hadrian between 119 AD and 127 AD. Later on, after 196 AD, another Roman emperor, Septimus Severus, who was born in Leptis Magna, provided his hometown with a new forum, theater, and temple. Once Leptis Magna had been a small port on the coast and a trading post for Carthaginian merchants. After Septimus Severus, it was one of the most splendid cities in the Roman world, and a center for Roman trade with peoples south of the Sahara Desert. Sadly, in time, Leptis Magna fell into ruins, and its marble and limestone were removed by local people to build homes and other structures. Dougga was luckier. It has been well preserved over the centuries. Today, visitors can see almost all the features of a Roman city. The forum, the baths, the slave market, the massive capitol with its giant statue of the Roman god Jupiter, and the amphitheater and hippodrome, which once provided entertainment for Dougga's inhabitants.
Well, the evidence for theatre in North Africa before the arrival of Rome is, as far as I know, nil. And therefore the presentation of theatrical performances of one sort or another could be said to be introduced from Rome. But then so is the amphitheatre, and so is the circus, and so is the bathhouse. These are all part and parcel of the trappings of Roman civilization, which the Africans embrace so readily.
The amphitheaters put on plays in which the actors wore huge masks so that their voices could be heard all over the theater. But some of the entertainment staged in amphitheaters was very bloody. At another Roman site in North Africa, El Jem, you can still see the rows of stone benches, which once held up to 35,000 people, and which rise 40 yards up a slope so that everyone could get a good view. The theater at El Jem was a giant 160 yards long and 137 yards wide. Gladiators used to fight to the death here, and Christians and other victims were torn to pieces by lions, leopards, and other fierce animals. Much later, in the 3rd and 4th centuries AD, many Romans in the cities of North Africa were converted to Christianity. But before that, Christians were regarded as enemies of the Roman state and its gods, and large numbers of them died in the arena.
At El Jem, the centre of the arena has substructures underneath it where gladiators and wild beasts could be kept before they were brought on. There are shafts for cages to be hoisted up to the arena from the cells underground so that animals could be released. All of this shows us some kind of an insight into the practical organisation that must have been required for staging spectacles of mass killing and mass hunting.
At El Jem, you can still visit the underground rooms where these unfortunate people were imprisoned before being forced out to face a violent, terrifying death. Sometimes, the lions and other wild animals were set on each other, and as they fought, the watching audience would cheer loudly, thoroughly enjoying themselves. The gladiators, too, faced lions in the arena, but at least they were armed with a variety of weapons. Some carried swords, others used three-pronged tridents. Some gladiators used large nets to entangle their opponents and bring them crashing to the ground. Some were armed only with a lasso. Some even fought blindfolded, on horseback. Needless to say, life for a gladiator was usually very short. If they lost a fight, the audience used to decide whether they lived or died. If a gladiator was lucky, the crowd might yell "Mitte," meaning "let him go." But if he was unlucky, the audience gave the thumbs down side and cried "Jugula," which meant cut his throat. At that, his victorious opponent killed him straight away. The theaters and hippodromes, also known as circuses, were extremely popular. But the real center of life was the forum. The forums in several Roman cities in North Africa have survived, some of them more complete than others. One of them is the forum at Leptis Magna, which was so big that it occupied almost 3 acres of land. Once, long ago, these places were full of crowds. Some people came there to discuss business or politics. Some used them to make speeches or recite poems. Others came to visit the law courts, the libraries, or the temples which surrounded the forum. Market traders set up their stalls. Barbers cut their customers' hair or gave them a shave. A forum had almost every kind of shop. Furriers who sold furs, chandlers who sold candles, as well as stonemasons, locksmiths, blacksmiths, silversmiths, and many others. It was all extremely noisy. None of this would have been possible without the soldiers of the Roman army. Everything depended on them. The rich trade, the luxurious life, the security of the ports where ships were loaded with fine cargoes to take back to Rome, the food and water supplies, and especially the peace enjoyed by the 8 million people who lived in Roman North Africa. In many ways, the Roman Empire was like an armed camp. Inside, Roman citizens and others who lived there were sure of being safe. Outside, there were enemy tribes and marauders who wanted to get in, but were kept back by the army which guarded the borders. The Roman army also provided the empire with many practical benefits. The army's engineers built a huge network of roads in North Africa, covering nearly 12,000 miles. This allowed people to move quickly and easily over very long distances, travel from city to city, or reach the seacoast from far inland. This was how the huge sacks of grain and wheat from the farmlands and barrels of wine or olives were able to reach the ports to be loaded onto the ships that sailed across the Mediterranean Sea to Rome. This was how tourists could visit faraway cities and enjoy the sights. But Roman roads were mainly used for one very important purpose: moving soldiers speedily from one place to another. The ability to do this became particularly vital by the 3rd century AD, when Roman-ruled territory stretched right across North Africa for nearly 1,600 miles. Because of the road network, the Romans were able to control this vast area with only one legion permanently stationed there. A Roman legion numbered between 4,000 and 6,000 soldiers and horsemen. This doesn't sound large today, but the entire Roman army consisted of only about 100 legions, or up to 600,000 men, and they had a vast empire to police and control.
Rome controlled North Africa with a single legion, essentially, which is in stark contrast to the situation in Britain, where it took 4 legions to hold down a much smaller area of territory. The reasons for this stem partly from the fact that, on the whole, the occupation of North Africa was not a simple matter of conquest, but expansion and assimilation. The process seems to have been helped by the fact that North Africa at that period was probably not terribly densely settled. Much of the area into which Rome gradually expanded was apparently occupied by semi-nomadic pastoralists, moving their flocks between summer and winter pastures. So there's a large area of territory and relatively few people in it.
We should also recognise, though, that nonetheless this is a military occupation, and that certainly when trouble threatened, the Romans were not averse to using force, whether against enemies external to the province or to stamp out resistance and rebellion within the province. And there are a number of occasions where revolts within the province are put down fairly savagely, and that's part and parcel of what the Roman Empire was about as well.
But as time went on, defending Roman North Africa against outside attack became more and more difficult. In 429 AD, Vandals from Germany, who had already invaded Roman Spain and France, crossed the Mediterranean to attack the North African cities. At Leptis Magna, the Vandals destroyed the outer wall. 10 years later, they overran Roman Carthage. By this time, even the Roman army was unable to stop these assaults. In 523 AD, Leptis Magna was invaded by fierce Berber tribesmen. They robbed the villas and temples and destroyed so much of the city that its citizens abandoned it. The Roman Empire in the west, centered at Rome, had collapsed in about 476 AD. But its eastern half, the Byzantine Empire, centered around Constantinople, now Istanbul in Turkey, survived. In 533 AD, the Byzantine Emperor Justinian sent his best general, Belisarius, to North Africa to retrieve what he could of the once great Roman province. Leptis Magna, or what was left of it, became the capital of Justinian's new territory. But Roman North Africa was never the same again. In time, the beautiful cities were covered in sand. The splendid roads were neglected, The great Roman temples fell into decay. The magnificent villas, where life had once been so luxurious, were empty and deserted. By 643 AD, when the region was attacked and occupied by the Muslims, the great days of Roman North Africa were well and truly over.